Good afternoon and welcome to Chatham House. My name is Andrew England. I'm the Middle East editor of the Financial Times, and I'm going to chair this timely panel on Iran. Obviously, it comes after yesterday's extraordinary day in the Middle East with Trump visiting Israel and Sharm el-Sheikh, the release of hostages, and Trump promising peace in the region. And obviously, you can't have peace in the region without dealing with the Iran question. So I'm delighted to have Dr. Sanam Vakil, the Middle East director of Chatham House and a leading expert on Iran, Vali Nasser from Johns Hopkins, an expert on Iran, and Dr. Mariam Mesmer, senior research fellow at Chatham House. Trump said yesterday that a deal with Iran would be great. He even said Iran wanted it. But there's a lot of people in Iran and outside the region who think the war's not over. We've had 2 years of tumult in the region. We've seen the first direct strikes between Israel and Iran. We've seen the shadow war burst into the open. We saw the 12-day war in June, during which Israel and the US bombed Iran's main nuclear sites. So, Vali, let me start with you. Is the war over?
In a way, no, the war is not over, largely because you had a 10-year ceasefire that President Trump imposed on both Iran and Israel, but neither did Israel actually achieve its war aims. And I think Iran, obviously not having been fully subdued, does not see itself as defeated, and would like to sort of restore a balance of power or balance of deterrence with Israel. And the United States, despite what President Trump claimed, cannot say that Iran's nuclear program can be satisfactorily now set aside. So all of those issues that led to the war are still there. And unless they are negotiated at the table between the US and Iran, then you have to think that at some point the chance of conflict would go up again.
Sanam, we know the US envoy Steve Witkoff and Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, are still having discussions. They're still communicating. They both said that. We know that Trump said they were close to a deal before Israel attacked in June. What's preventing them getting to a deal, and why aren't they talking now? If Trump is saying, let's do a deal, we've seen Iran say they would like to do a deal on their terms. What are the stumbling blocks?
It's a good question to ask, particularly also since yesterday, President Trump again dangled the prospects of a deal, intimating really that part of this new Middle East requires an Iran deal. I think what's missing is a couple of things. I think both sides understand that a deal is necessary, but the terms and conditions of those deals need to be arrived at. And excuse me, Iran still insists that negotiations with the Trump administration should be indirect. And currently, there are no real clear interlocutors, not facilitators or conveners, which is the role that the Omanis played and other countries have played in the past. What they really need is a mediator. And it's worthwhile remembering that just a few weeks ago, the E3, Germany, France, and the UK, snap back sanctions on Iran, really sort of using that to pressure the Islamic Republic to get back into negotiations with Washington. But having taken snapback forward, they too are no longer the real mediators. So we're in search of, let's say, new mediators. And then secondly, it's about bridging the divide on issues where Iran is still looking for a face-saving solution, if you will, trying to preserve its right to indigenous enrichment, even if it's at a small level for research purposes, and the United States, which is divided between the neocons and the restrainers within the Trump administration, is trying to show that they've gotten a better deal, that they've imposed zero enrichment on Iran, and then there are other terms and conditions that they are looking to address. But I think it's a matter of time. This is a president that is unconventional, certainly, and is looking to solve problems in unconventional ways. the devil, of course, like in the events of yesterday, will be in the details. So we know that the contours of the deal are out there. What we don't know are what those details are going to be and who's going to bring these people together.
Okay. Marion, when you listen to Trump, he said that after the US dropped bunker buster bombs on the Tanz and Fordo, we obliterated the nuclear program. It's almost like he's saying we dealt with it, it's over. But we still don't know the whereabouts of the 408 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. A lot of experts will tell you, including diplomats, that the program has been severely damaged but not destroyed. How likely is it that Iran could resume its nuclear program, its nuclear activity, particularly enrichment? And when you're in Iran, you hear a lot of people worried that Israel will strike again, and that maybe if the attention's off Gaza and there's a halt to the war in Gaza, Israel would turn its attention back to Iran. How big a risk is that if the question of the nuclear program is unresolved?
If the question of the nuclear program is unresolved, then I think that's a risk that's going to remain, in huge part because it's more of a political decision rather than anything else whether Iran wants to restart its nuclear program. The US strikes undoubtedly have done significant damage, but we also know that they haven't completely destroyed all nuclear facilities in Iran. There was a question prior to the strikes, there was a question about Iran building a new enrichment site that the US wouldn't have targeted in those strikes. And of course, there's a lot of knowledge building and knowledge management, knowledge capability that Iran also still possesses. Israel, of course, targeted nuclear scientists as part of their attacks, but a nuclear program is bigger than just some lead scientists. There will be a grown knowledge structure in universities, there will be a knowledge community, and while that community might have lost some leaders, a lot of that infrastructure is still there, and Iran is in a really strong position with regards to its nuclear program in the sense that it has built up a lot of domestic capabilities over a long period of time. So, even if centrifuges were damaged, Iran undoubtedly has the capabilities to rebuild them. And you, of course, already mentioned the highly enriched uranium stockpile, where we're not sure where that is being kept at the moment. So those are all components that essentially could be used to restart a nuclear program. And we also know that Iran, at the very least, wants to retain a peaceful nuclear program that it can use for research purposes and for nuclear energy. And so I think in many ways, the nuclear program is the key question to resolve, to see whether we can get to a more stable situation in the region or not.
Salam, I'm going to come back to you. There's one person in Iran who ultimately matters, and that's the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He's been in power for decades. He's concerned about succession. He's 86 years old. He's probably faced arguably his biggest crisis as supreme leader. What is he thinking? Is he thinking about preservation, succession, or is he thinking about resistance and defiance? What is the calculation? What is his calculation?
Obviously, it's very hard to put yourself in the mindset of someone who has been in power for as long as Ali Khamenei, since 1989. He is the region's longest serving autocrat today. And he has survived many crises. It's striking. I mean, when the day does come, we will sort of go through all of the crises. But certainly the 12-day war might take the cake, and I'm curious to hear Valerie's view on this. I think he's thinking of all of the above. This is about preservation of his legacy, and we very much see in today's terms how leaders are so concerned with their legacies while still in office or in positions of power. But secondly, it is very much about what has driven the Islamic Republic for well over 40 years is the security and stability of the Islamic Republic above all. And that's tied, of course, to his legacy. And what the 12-day war really showed, I think, internally but externally for anyone who had any doubts or questions, is that the Islamic Republic is an institutional system. It's not personalistic, and thereby, despite the shocks, the intelligence failures, and Israel's deep penetration of Iran, the system pulled itself together and the chains of command were quickly recapitalized, and there wasn't a collapse of the Islamic Republic. That doesn't mean that there is no divisions within the political establishment. They certainly are. It's a factionalized system with deep divides, and they've been there for decades. That doesn't mean that there are not deep social and economic and political cleavages across the country, deep frustrations with the system. But I think that the fact that the system survived the huge shock of the 12-day war and recovered, gives a leader like Ali Khamenei pause for what comes next. It's about preserving the system. In 1989, when he came to power, the system did undergo transformation. There was constitutional reform. They empowered certain institutions. They created new institutions. And I think that the Islamic Republic, or the key individuals across the system, are looking to show unity and looking into their future and trying to create a more stable, functioning, institutionalized process. They announced while he was in a bunker somewhere that there were names in an envelope. And we know that this is a system that relies on processes and institutions. So I certainly expect there will be more details of that process or how it will unfold. And what's been very interesting to me as an outcome of the 12-day war is that we are back seeing people in Iran talk about the future and talk about how things might develop. And we're seeing contending ideas of governance reform in Iran. And so the more open space, I think, also gives the elites and someone like Khamenei an opportunity to maneuver more openly as well.
Yeah. It's interesting because I was in Iran in July, and the two themes that I came away with was one's the sense of anxiety and one that the war is going to change things, but nobody quite knew how it would change. And we've seen some social change. That hijab law has been far more relaxed. There are more music concerts, etc. happening. It looks like the regime is trying to tap into the sense of patriotism that came out during the war. But what kind of genuine change can we expect, Vali? I mean, you and I spoke during the war, and you said that this war would bring change. But beyond, I don't want to say the cosmetic, but beyond the social changes, what kind of fundamental change could it bring, or not, to the way the system is ruled under this theocratic regime that's been in power, since '79?
Well, I mean, if the expectation is for a sudden, drastic 180-degree change, perhaps we would be disappointed. It's not necessarily around the corner. And I think, as you said, the sense of patriotism, the siege mentality, et cetera, also dampens enthusiasm for that kind of political change. But often change comes exactly like this. It's if you wear a mask long enough, it becomes your face. And so obviously the issue of hijab in Iran was not a concession that was given from above. It was a fight that the Iranian women won. In other words, the entire uprising, etc., ended up putting aside the issue of hijab altogether. Nobody observes it if they don't want to in Iran. You can go into the airport, into government offices, into all official settings. There are women without hijab. Women are also even showing their bellies in Tehran. It's not an issue. Nobody's persecuted. An Iranian president said nobody will be fined or jailed for not observing the hijab. But it also suggests that there's a certain degree of pragmatism that is at play, that the top priority of this regime is actually it's national security and national survival. It's not ideology or theocracy at this point in time. Now, why I think it's significant to sort of take this change seriously is because, building on what Sanam was saying, is that Iran sees itself in a long war with the United States. In fact, it's been in war with the United States in its own mind for over 40 years. This is only the last battle. Now, what has happened in this 12-day war is that in their mind, in the minds of the leadership, every assumption they had about the West and the United States was actually validated. That you can't trust the US, that the US is not after the nuclear program, is after the regime, that it wants to not only topple the Islamic Republic, it may want to topple the Iranian state, All of these things basically was validated. But where I think is significant is that they lost their most important line of defense, which was Hezbollah and the Assad regime, and were put in a position to have to defend Iran from within their own border, and not very satisfactorily, one might say. And their largest leverage, which was the nuclear program, was significantly downgraded. And you have to think that this has secondary, tertiary impact on the way that the regime operates. In other words, you cannot just continue the way that you did before. So I think short of a complete implosion or collapse, I think already we are well into a major transformation in the character and nature of the Islamic Republic. I would say sort of we're in that phase between Mao and Deng Xiaoping. It's not going to be fast, it's not going to be overnight, but I think what you observed in Iran are quite significant. I just cannot conceive of the Islamic Republic going back to enforcing the kinds of social restrictions that it did even 5-6 years ago. And then, you would say then the next change will come on top of this change and on top of this change. So now the battle lines for women is not hijab, is actually patrimonial legal rules about inheritance, divorce, etc. For the larger populations, it's about elections, it's about constitutional changes, bureaucratic changes. And so I think Iran is in the throes of massive change. So on the one side, you have this picture of a country that is at war. It's fighting for its survival, economically in war with Israel. And on the other hand, already the massive change has started. Now, for the West, I think what's very key is that all the focus is on this nuclear issue, and also on an image of maybe the Islamic Republic, which is a little bit outdated, without sort of saying what kinds of policies that you follow now can actually impact this other much more important development. I mean, in the minds of President Trump, these things are disconnected necessarily. I don't think there's a game plan. Or in the minds of the Europeans, it's all about how do we put snapback sanctions so that they would do X, Y, and Z with IEA, without thinking that there's something much bigger already has started in Iran. And what might be the ways in which you might influence that in the right direction.
Right. Just something you mentioned, Mariam, the axis of resistance, it's been seen as a key part of Iran's security strategy since the war with Iraq. Asymmetrical warfare rather than conventional warfare. Just how weakened has that axis been, and how might that impact on Iran's thinking?
I think that's a really good question. We've seen in some ways how Iran's traditional relationships have been significantly weakened. I mean, the Assad regime is no longer, Bashar al-Assad is essentially in exile in Moscow. Hamas has been significantly weakened, Hezbollah has been significantly weakened. So all of these traditional relationships that Iran has relied on in order to project force, in order to be able to influence what's happening elsewhere in the region, doesn't necessarily exist in the same way that it did even a few years ago. But at the same time, what I also think is quite interesting is that the constellation of perhaps for lack of a better umbrella term, nuclear like-minded states has also changed quite significantly, right? So part of the reason why the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was as successful as it was because you had Russia, China, the US, the UK, France, and Germany all essentially push in the same direction on this. And Russia used its significant diplomatic relations with Iran for positive effect. It essentially was willing to make sure that Iranian negotiators were willing to come back to the table even when things were difficult. And that sort of, I don't think it's an alliance because we could never really call it that, but that kind of configuration of states that at one point were able to move in the same direction on this very specific issue is also looking much more fragmented now. I mean, Sanam described how the E3 essentially tried to pressure Iran to get back to the table with the US, but even between the US and the E3, there are significant cleavages, not just when it comes to Middle East policy, but also on lots of other issues. And the relationship between Russia and Iran has changed completely over the last few years. And so I think, something that undoubtedly will be on the Iranian government's mind is essentially how to use that balance of relationships and whether it can actually be used, in a positive way. I could well imagine, for example, that Russia and China, given that they weren't in favor of snapback sanctions, might also be helping Iran evade some of those sanctions as best as they can. And given the much closer relationship when it comes to the exchange of military technology and so on between Russia, China, and Iran, that could actually also have a significant impact on what the Iranian government is able to do.
Sanam, the Revolutionary Guards, central institution, economic power, military power, political power. Many of their top leaders were killed in the Israel war, the 12-day war. It's humiliation for the Guards in terms of the level of Israeli intelligence penetration. And yet, when you speak to people, when I was in Iran, people were telling me that actually you'll see a new generation come to the fore, which could actually be more hawkish, more militaristic, less pragmatic without the experience of serving in the Iran-Iraq war, which might push Iran in another direction. And people have always expected the IRGC to have a role in succession. So how, as a body, or as an institution, have they emerged from the 12-day war, and what role are they likely to have with this new cadre of commanders in the future trajectory of the Republic, particularly with succession in mind?
I think that's a really good question, and not one that I have a certain answer to. I mean, we're watching the changes that might emerge from Iran from the war, and I think those changes will come very slowly over time. These are certainly untested people, second or third in command in and across the institutions. What's interesting is that these are, of course, individuals who have been part of these systems, right? So they're not unknowns or complete outsiders. It's just that they haven't been as visible to us. So I would say, on the one hand, the culture of the institutions is certainly imbued in the individuals. The decision-making remains still very consensus-based, and as an outcome of the war, the Islamic Republic recreated a council, a defense council that sits under the Supreme National Security Council, where foreign policy decisions are debated. And in that defense council, I think, again, there will be debates on how things will go forward. What's interesting to me, and I don't have an answer for, but I'll be looking out for, is I don't imagine that the Islamic Republic today, with its security and stability being, foremost on the agenda, is going to change anything too much. Rather, I sort of anticipate and expect that the Islamic Republic right now is, of course, maybe seeing itself as in between another confrontation, not sure if there will be one, looking to prevent one if possible, but rebuild their defense capabilities. Certainly, narratives about Iran and its role in the region have been punctured. There is a sense, of course, that Iran has been weakened, or that maybe we're in a post-Iran Middle East. And so Iran will be looking to, I think, reproject power, but hasn't necessarily figured out how to do so. I would imagine that Iran is also going to be rebuilding, refortifying the so-called axis of resistance, which has retreated, not been eliminated, as Marian said. Hamas is still very much there. So is Hezbollah. And perhaps the axis of resistance will reconstitute in a different way. This is an evolving entity. The ballistic missile program, from the Iranian perspective, and it's important to understand how countries and individuals see themselves, while maybe had a 30% penetration rate into Israel, was a 30% penetration rate into Israel, with all of the help of the United States and NATO and Central Command. So perhaps further investment in their ballistic missile program, which is interestingly the biggest issue for the Europeans that are very frustrated by the growing Russian-Iranian relationship, et cetera. So I would imagine that they find ways to reinvest, double down, and rebuild over time. And maybe there's some innovation over time. I mean, we've watched how wars are fought in very different ways, and I think they're preparing for that next layer and generation of war with untested people that have something to prove, really.
Just very succinctly is perhaps the question I should have asked at the beginning, because
Sorry.
there is a perception that sometimes you hear that the regime is about to collapse, that
yes.
it is incredibly weak. I mean, let's just very succinctly clarify that. How weak has it emerged after, or how has it emerged after the 12-day war? I mean, is it on the brink of collapse?
Well, I mean, I think every year for as long as I've been working on Iran, and maybe also you, Vali, like we've been talking about the fragility and the collapse and the moment of revolution for the Islamic Republic. And I think, and I don't want to put words in Vali's mouth, but we are watching the change of the Islamic Republic, not necessarily the collapse of the Islamic Republic. I don't see Iran balkanizing tomorrow, but certainly it is in transformation, and the 12-day war was like an accelerant on a transformation that we were already witnessing. The IRGC, like every institution, is looking to preserve itself, its influence, and its capabilities within an evolving system. So how it's going to change, we can't predict. We can offer you scenarios, but they're certainly going to be influential, and perhaps even more so on the political sphere, but they remain deeply loyal and connected to the supreme leader. They came up together, they grew up together, they have a symbiotic relationship. I don't foresee a coup or any kind of military takeover by the IRGC. It will be an evolution of them in the system.
Vali, on this, if we don't get a deal with the US and Iran, and Trump maintains maximum pressure, then the Iranians will say we got the resistance economy, which is what they've said since Trump withdrew from the deal in 2018 and first imposed hundreds and hundreds of sanctions on it. But how long can that be sustained? I mean, this year we've seen water shortages, electricity shortages. In Tehran, they've declared national holidays because of the shortages of water and electricity. Government workers go home at midday. The economy is under constant pressure. There's 34% inflation. So can it sustain itself? And how, if there is no deal and the sanctions continue to strangle the economy?
I think it's a good question. I mean, building on what Sanam said, the 12-day war suggested that actually the Islamic Republic cannot be forced to collapse easily. I mean, that was really Israel's game plan. An intelligence coup that allows you to decapitate the system as they did with Hezbollah, and then the whole thing will fall apart. And it didn't. And I think the Iranians are now prepared, and they say it, that when the war comes, Israel may kill a large number of civilian leaders this time. And there's been a mandate that every sort of civilian official has to already appoint up to 4 people below, as if that happens. So in a way, there is resilience there. And I think the reaction of the Iranian public, which was a rally to the flag, not necessarily to the regime, but rally to the flag and defense of the country and patriotism, etc., suggests that war does not necessarily force the collapse, if you were to say. So the war is actually much more so over the economy, right? So in other words, if you have a significant degradation of Iran's fundamental infrastructure, which has already begun, water, electricity, industrial capacity, roads, etc., that might create a very different circumstance. Although I have to say, having worked on a lot of developing countries over the years, in Africa, in Asia, you always expected that it just cannot go one more year like this, and yet they did. Yet those countries are still there under similar regimes, although no two countries are alike. But I would say that the longer this sanctions goes on, the more it gives also impetus to a voice inside Iran that this is being too cost-free for the United States and Europe, that they could impose the sanctions or give a green light for Israel to hit, but there's no blowback for them. And once Iran played this game, right, a year after the maximum pressure was imposed, Iran attacked oil facilities and tankers in the Gulf. It began escalating pressure on the US. It went to 84% enriched uranium. At one point, it sort of normalized the fact that it would enrich up to 60%. And so, there is a period in which you're just not going to have just a steady decline, that the likelihood of Iran actually trying to change the calculus on President Trump tested. See, is he this comfortable with just imposing sanctions and then forgetting and going somewhere else? Or is he really willing to put skin in the game and deal with a much higher tension? When you talk about the new generation in IRGC, this new generation up and coming, these are veterans of the Syria war, as opposed to veterans of the Iran-Iraq war. And so they're much more likely, and they're already making this argument in Iran, that Iran needs to impose cost, that it cannot be the only country in this war that is actually absorbing the cost, and it's just far too easy for Trump right now. And he's making assumptions that basically calculates that Iran will not respond. So this is not going to be a steady, I think, smooth picture of just singular decline over 2-3 years, that it actually increases the risk of military confrontation in the region, which then would write its own rules going forward.
Yeah. Mariam, one thing that Iranian officials would tell you is that the resistance economy can survive because of its relationships with Arab states, Gulf states in particular, which have made a great deal of, I would say, progress over the last couple of years. You had the Saudi-Iran deal brokered by China in 2023. The UAE is consciously trying to develop economic links with the UAE as a way of dealing with the hostility. And that serves Iran. And it also, in a way, it should impact on the mindset of Iran when it is looking to respond to US or Israeli hostility. Will they go after UAE military bases in the UAE? Obviously, they did in Doha after the 12-day war. But how has that relationship evolved, and how has that impacted on the way Arab states, and Gulf states in particular, are looking at Iran and that layer of regional tension, and what does that mean for Iran?
Just one quick word actually on what Vali just said, because I think, if we look at North Korea as an example of a state that's been under significant sanctions for decades, and the population is not doing very well at all, actually, but the regime is able to carry on, and North Korea is able to be a significant regional spoiler. And so, I think if we're worrying about the state of the Iranian economy and the impact of sanctions, that's one, I think, sort of perhaps more scary example that I would point to. But to answer your question about regional relationships, something that I found really interesting is that you could see a lot of other regional states hesitate a bit at the outset of tensions between Iran and Israel. I think in part also because many of these states have been in a process of normalizing their relationship with Israel, and I think some of them didn't necessarily want to jeopardize that process. So I think looking to the future, it will probably help to have other states in the region that primarily want a stable region and that want to find a good solution for this. And I think, if we sort of tie that back to the nuclear question again, I think some of the solutions that have been floated around whether, for example, some sort of enrichment consortium might be a pathway to provide more stability, they're technically very challenging to resolve. But what I like about it is that it's a creative step towards a problem that's been very stuck for a long time. So while I'm not sure that a consortium would necessarily be the right way forward, because there are a lot of technical challenges, I mean, there are a lot of political challenges, but there are also a lot of technical challenges around how you could verify such a consortium, how you would transfer materials and so on, and how you could make sure that that's not diverted in any way or essentially ends up in several military nuclear programs rather than just one potential one. The good thing is that it makes the problem the responsibility of additional stakeholders, which I think could really help get to a more stable solution.
Okay. Last question for you, Sanam, before we open up to questions. All these issues we talked about, the sort of state of flux, the transition, the economic pressures, the external pressures. On top of that, you've got people like Netanyahu, you've got the exiled Iranian opposition who would like to see a public uprising. They would like to see from within. What are the risks of that in reality? We haven't seen that. We didn't see it during the war, but there are all these pressures. How likely or unlikely is it that you could see movement from within?
I fully expect not because I know when, but I fully expect that there will be more protests in Iran for no other reason than there are protests all the time in Iran. There is someone on Twitter who does protest tracking.
But there's protests and there's uprisings.
Yes, okay, so protests are common, and then we have had a series of uprisings in the country now, going back to 1999. So I fully imagine that one of these protests on any myriad of issues can certainly become national protests again. Again, hard to understand the spark or the issue, but I fully expect that there could be that sort of outcome. But is it going to be coordinated and organized and potentially revolutionary? I have been on the record to say I see that outcome as very unlikely for a few reasons. The system in Iran is institutionalized, and thereby every time it adapts its institutionalized response, there is a playbook of repression that is coercive and adaptive and very effective, and of course impacting people internally in a very brutal way. Secondly, of course, the system has upscaled their surveillance and monitoring of the society, building ties with China and Russia to do so, among other countries. And I think that's very sophisticated. Thirdly, of course, it is adaptive in that it has been successful in sort of trying to break linkages among the classical sort of revolutionary groups or protest building groups in society, be them students or activists or women, etc. And thirdly, and I think this is, there is no real unified opposition movement inside Iran. There are a number of fractured political opposition leaders inside the country that are united as Iranian nationalists, divided on the way forward. So, that is something that this system very much exploits. And will continue to do so if Iranians of all different stripes can't get in a room and discuss what sort of political reform, governance reform they would like to envisage. And the same exists externally. There's a more organized monarchist group, and then there are fractured movements across the political spectrum. So without organization, coordination, and the like, again, this system, is very good at sustaining itself.
So really, you're suggesting quite a lot of resilience, really.
Yes, I would say 46 years proves resilience. I think we have to acknowledge that the system has been much more resilient than we or people maybe even inside the country have wanted it to be, and that requires, maybe a reassessment of Iran. I think there are very different Irans inside the country, and then the ones that we have in our imagination for those of us outside the country. And for Western policymakers, unless they understand what Iranians want and what is actually happening inside Iran, and instead if they latch themselves onto the monarchist view of Iran, they risk making real sort of strategic mistakes in how they engage with the Islamic Republic.
Very quickly, Vali, because you have good questions.
No, I agree with everything Sanam said, but I also want to say that the poorer a population becomes, the less likely it is that it can carry out uprisings. In other words, the Western sanctions are singularly responsible for actually retarding uprising inside Iran. Every democracy movement we've seen around the world has been associated, every well-led revolution we've seen around the world has been associated with the growth of middle class and its prosperity. And therefore, a population that can barely make ends meet is much less likely to be able to organize, to be able to risk to organize, and therefore there is an outside contribution to actually that resilience.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I should have said at the beginning, this is on the record, and it's also online, so apologies, but it is on the record. We'll take questions now from the floor and from the online viewers. If we have a microphone, there's a gentleman at the front here. Please state your name.
Thank you very much. Ibrahim Aziz, lecturer at University in Salahuddin University back home, Kurdistan. My question about the external levels of the Iran. Iran has been powerful, one of the powerful states in the Middle East before 7 October. Post 7 October, has been weakened because of the Hezbollah being weakened, Bashar has collapsed, Hamas is somehow been weakened, is backed in Iran, and Houthi as well. But the only Iranian-backed group has not been attacked by others, for example, Israel and United States, is PMF, Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq. And Iraq strategically and economically is important for Iran. If Iran will be weakened, should be, that's the reason, should be some way to stopping this economic for Iran and this intervene to Iraq by PMF.
Okay, well, the question is
why PMF, Hashd al-Shabi, has not been attacked by others to be weakened like Hezbollah, like,
Yeah, Mariam, do you want to take that? It's interesting. I mean, they were hit by the US, obviously, in February 2024 after 3 American soldiers were killed. But why do you think they sort of kept their head down?
Great question. I mean, I obviously can't say for sure, so this is just speculation on my end. But I would assume that other groupings in the region were more important, and that, in the grand scheme of things, there are other relationships that Iran has that are probably more significant. I mean, I would say, especially if we're talking about economic relationships and sanction evasion, I would focus much more on the relationships that Iran has rebuilt with Russia, with China, with other countries. Like Azerbaijan, for example. I think those kind of relationships are more significant in that regard than those with that group.
We have a gentleman here.
Thank you very much for the invite. John Warren, a retired physician. There's a lot of discussion, understandably, about Iran, past wars and future wars, but not so much about peace, and half the population is female. And the women's revolution did get a Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago. What does that tell us about the possibilities for diplomacy, which isn't one of the subheadings here? There's just war, nuclear standoff and shaken alliances, but not diplomacy, which you might expect for Chatham House.
Well, I think we did discuss it. Sanam?
Sure. I'm happy to take the diplomacy. I mean, certainly diplomacy has been shaken because it's, worthwhile remembering that on June 12th, when was it, June 12th? 23rd, sorry, my days are all mixed up. Iran was on the brink of going into its 5th round of negotiations with the US and Oman. So the Iranians certainly, I think, were caught off guard, expected perhaps that a strike might be imminent, but didn't expect it going into negotiations. And so thereby, obviously, diplomacy has been railroaded for the time being. I think the aim, though, for many in Iran, perhaps even the Iranian President Pezeshkian and his cabinet, is to get back to that negotiating table, but on better, fairer terms. President Trump, or there are people in the Trump administration that would like to see complete surrender and capitulation of Iran's position, and the Islamic Republic is quite steadfast as a system in not fully surrendering, and in fact looking for terms that would be face-saving. And I think the aim, though, for this Pezeshkian administration certainly would be to obtain a deal that would guarantee them access to frozen funds abroad and eventual sanctions relief. And that is what would be discussed between Tehran and Washington, directly or indirectly, whether it's on WhatsApp with Witkoff, who has been amenable to an easier deal, or at a negotiating table with the right interlocutors. I think in addition to Tehran and Washington, it's worthwhile also thinking about the landscape of the Middle East since the 12-day war as well. I mean, yesterday, was positive, also, theatrical, if you ask me. But certainly the landscape in the Middle East has very much shifted over the past 2 years, but over the past few months. And most countries in the Middle East are looking to avoid another round between Iran and Israel, because the fallout of Iran and Israel impacted countries in the Gulf, Qatar, specifically, and the broader view is to take advantage of this changing landscape to reinvest in governance reform in Lebanon and Syria, but also ultimately to have a more stable regional environment. And that requires, I think, more agency from Gulf states in particular to support new negotiations and new rounds of diplomacy. You know, the two pillars, the two sort of unaddressed crises of the region for various reasons are, of course, the Palestinian issue and the Iran issue. And if you're thinking of a more stable Middle East, you're addressing both sides of this coin.
Okay. Valerie, we've got two questions online which are similar, so I'm going to put them to you. Will Iran try and evolve its relationship with Russia or China in the wake of the 12-day war? And Iran typically doesn't want to negotiate from a position of weakness. This is from, the first question was from Simon Webb, the second from Rob McKay. Iran doesn't typically want to negotiate from a position of weakness, so will it seek to repair its air defences and missile systems before it negotiates? And will it look to Iran and China for support? And would they, I guess?
Well, I mean, in a way, Iran's most effective defense over the years has been offense. And even in this war, I think their conclusion would be that they can't necessarily get air defense systems that can stand up to F-35s, and they can't do so in the short term. But what really forced or got President Trump to ask for an unconditional ceasefire at the end was Iranian missiles, if you were to say. So I think, as Sanam said earlier, that they would, or I don't know, I think you mentioned that they would double down on the ballistic missile system much more as a way of creating a balance of deterrence. Yes, relationship with Russia and China is probably will strengthen, but in what ways will remain to be seen. Some of it might be diplomatic at the United Nations. Some of it might be in terms of economic support. But I don't think Iran would see Russia or China as a one-stop shop where they could basically solve all of Iran's security problems. So it's part of the package, if you were to say. And I think there's also with China and Russia, there's a greater complexity. Those countries also have to worry about the United States reaction. They also have deep relationships with other countries in the Gulf, which also figures in here both positively and negatively. And then I think Iran has a very, very furtive debate about what is the best path forward. Iran's president, foreign minister, those are people who still believe that there can be a deal with the United States. The best way out of this security dilemma is de-escalation on the nuclear issue. And then there are those who would say, you need to turn east and look to Russia and China or other mechanisms. Again, this is not something that's going to be suspended in midair. It all depends on what are the next moves. I mean, Sanam's correct. I think it's wrong to say that Iran doesn't want to talk. In fact, in New York, there was a meeting that the E3 put together in which Iran agreed to have a face-to-face meeting with Mr. Witkoff, who didn't show up to the meeting. And the president keeps saying that Iran has to come to the table, but it means that Iran has to come to the table and accept unconditional surrender, which is not negotiation. That's basically something completely different. So if this picture doesn't change, or if it changes, I think we might have a very different dynamic set in.
Thank you. Questions? This lady here, please.
Thank you for the talk. My name's Madeline. I'm an MPhil student at Cambridge researching Houthi and Hezbollah reactions to the death of President Raisi last year on Telegram. And my question's for you, Sanam. You were talking about the doubling down and rebuilding of the Axis. And so my question is about what Hezbollah's migration to Iraq, which I heard you talk about recently, what that means for Lebanon and the wider region. Thank you.
Well, okay. So parts of Hezbollah have migrated, or individuals and families, particularly during the war period, certainly migrated to parts of Iraq. And so have parts of the axis of resistance as well. I wouldn't say the whole entity has moved. It's still very much present in Lebanon. I think what we've seen, the axis of resistance is really interesting and hard to study simultaneously. So well done for adding some work to what we're trying to understand. The axis of resistance is adaptive, and it's gone through so many shocks over the years. You know, the most profound shock was the killing of Qasem Soleimani in 2020, and I think we have to study the effects of this 2-year period. You know, after Qasem Soleimani died, the axis of resistance became much more coordinated and interdependent, and it was managed in a very different way by Iran. And the groups began to work together much more rather than through Qasem Soleimani himself. So I don't know how it's going to move in this next phase. I think, you know, the groups are looking to demonstrate resilience in their local context, and then it will be interesting to see if how the narrative of resistance will evolve. Right now, you know, there's this global attention on Palestine and Palestinian statehood, which is part of the resistance narrative. You know, the other parts are anti-American, anti-imperial, anti-Israeli. You know, much of the resilience of the axis of resistance will be connected to what happens with Palestine and Israel and the United States in the region, and that could revive the ideology and help with recruitment, and then financially, you know, certainly there will be efforts to recapitalize and recoup. We just don't know, but they're heavily involved in regional smuggling. They have trade networks. There's much more resilience than we can see, you know, on a day-to-day basis.
This gentleman's been very patient over here.
My name is Sanjay, and I do my master's in international relations from King's. Firstly, I would like to thank you all for taking your time to take through this complicated issue. I have 2 questions. Firstly, with respect to the Houthis, because in the 12-day war or the general Israeli-Gaza war, the only group that was able to sustain and hold on till the end was the Houthis. Despite the death of the prime minister and their entire cabinet, they have come to show themselves as the resistance to single-handedly double down on international trade, pressure on supply chains, etc. So how crucial would the Iranian-Houthi cooperation be in the coming years? And my second question is more related to the region itself, because on the eastern side of the Iranian borders, you have the Afghanistan-Pakistan clashes that are going on. So Baluchistan is a potential site where protests are happening significantly in Iran, and the Khorasan province in the east is also creating lots of problems. And now with the Gaza deal completed, President Erdogan's thoughts would be on Iran, because Erdogan himself is a political...
The question.
Sorry. On political, so how fragmented or would you say that Iran feels from its regional neighbors, mainly Turkey, Afghanistan and Pakistan? Thank you.
Thank you. Valerie, do you want to start with the first question? The Houthi relationship's complex. It's not as straightforward as people think, is it?
No, it's very complex, and also Houthis' own domestic situation with their population and terrorists is very different, for instance, with Hezbollah's, with its own. And these local calculations were important in terms of how aggressively they entered into the fray, and that also applies to Hashd al-Shabi as well. So it's not like, you know, these are autonomous organizations that are sort of on autopilot from Tehran. They have their own local considerations. And secondly, I think the Houthis is very complex for Iran because it's part of Iran's calculation with Saudi Arabia. So, you know, there is a peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia so long as it holds, so long as it's important to Iran. I think, you know, who the Houthis will attack, which direction they will fight, you know, that will be quite important. I think Sanam is correct that, you know, the axis of resistance still matters to Iran. It's not zero. It's not what it was. It's not 100 that it was before, but it's not zero either. These are relationships that they invested for a very long time. These forces, Iran believes, will matter to their countries in the longer term, aside from the relationship with Iran. So I think they will maintain those relationships. I think it's possible to overread some of this. So the Iranians don't have a worry about Baluchistan sort of being an instigation point for mass uprising in Iran. There is an issue with Afghan refugees, Afghanistan, which is pretty complicated. They did expel a large number of Afghan refugees, but also Afghan labor is as integral now to Iran's economy, given Iran's demographics, as North Africans are to the French, or any migrant group is to European countries. That's actually largely Iran's labor force for varieties of services, etc., is Afghans. And yes, Iranians are very sensitive, but I think Iranians are more sensitive to U.S. being back in the Bagram airbase than they are sensitive to Pakistan and Afghanistan having a fight, or over the issues of water that they have issues with the Taliban. And in fact, everything that's going on is likely going to make the Taliban move closer to Iran than has been the case. But the more this kind of a talk happens about Iran breaking up, Iranians have a historical psychosis about outsiders, particularly Westerners, wanting to break up their country. It goes back to the 19th century. The more you threaten this, the less likely it is that the population will be looking about threatening the Islamic Republic, etc. And in fact, during the war, that became an issue. That Israel is not after the Islamic Republic, is after the Iranian state as a whole. It's supporting Kurdish groups, is supporting Azerbaijani groups, Azeri groups, that the Iranians believe that not just the Turks, but the Republic of Azerbaijan, Israel, etc., are supporting separatist groups. This actually creates a common ground between the population and the state around protection of the territorial integrity of Iran. It adds to the resilience that you actually mentioned at the beginning.
Sanam, I've got a question for you online from Stephen Andrews, and I'm going to ask it because I've asked it to you before many times. Khamenei is 86. Who might replace him, and what might that mean? Now, before we talked about Raisi, the former president who died in the helicopter crash. Then people talked about Moshtaba, Khamenei's son. Has that changed after the war? Do we even know who's the front runner?
No, I mean, we've never known, to be very honest. People like me have, tried to venture guesses, and my guess died in a helicopter crash last May. So I have no idea. I would suspect if they're going to stick to the process, and the system likes to rely on that process. It's written in the Constitution. They will convene the Assembly of Experts. There will be some names, and whoever wins the vote. I would look at the key high-ranking figures that look like the Supreme Leader did in 1989, and that would be a sort of candidate I would look for, someone who's pious, young, revolutionary, loyal to the system above all. But the system can very much move. I don't think this is a hereditary system. It doesn't make sense to me. This is a system that still defines itself as revolutionary.
Will the next Supreme Leader have the same powers as this Supreme Leader?
Well, that I don't know. I would, again, look at history as a guide for what is going to come. I would imagine, but it might be too hard within a very factionalized Iran. I would imagine another round of constitutional reform, thinking, as what has worked, what hasn't worked, maybe empowering certain institutions and disenfranchising others. But what comes next is certainly going to be interesting, and what we're seeing today is key individuals and institutions vying for their future in the next version of the Iranian state, and it could be Islamic Republic 3.0, it could be an Iranian republic. I mean, we just don't know.
Okay. One last question before we go. Gentleman here in the middle.
Hi, Jordan Bauman from the University of Waterloo in Canada. Maybe this question comes from a little bit of ignorance, but it plays into the last question. Why hasn't Ali Khamenei been assassinated yet? Is that a logistical problem, or is that a strategic decision that's been made, do you think?
Vali, that sounds right up your alley.
Well, I mean, President Trump at one point suggested that he had prevented Israel from assassinating him. But from what I have gathered, they couldn't for varieties of reasons that they were not able to do so. And I think the conversation I hear is that Iranians are expecting that if the war resumes, he obviously would be a prime target.
It would be extraordinary, though.
It would be
extraordinary. Even in these circumstances,
No. I mean, of course. I mean, Sanam is correct. I mean, Khamenei is the longest ruling ruler in the region, but he's also, I think, the third longest ruler of Iran since Shah Abbas the Great in the mid-1500s. And in a couple of more years, he would be equaling the Shah or exceeding it. When somebody has been at the helm as a key decision maker that has shaped the country, and you remove him, particularly through a foreign government killing him, it is going to be a massive shock to the system. How Iran would react is not easy to tell. But I do think also the system has now copiously planned for it in terms of how it might handle that happens. But the key issue to succession is when will it happen? In the middle of a war with assassination, or at a more peaceful time in a natural circumstance? That would be greatly important in what kind of a reaction even that council would take in terms of what does the country need at that point in time.
Could it happen before the death of Khamenei?
Well, he apparently has a list that he prepared, and I'm sure he has, because there is an expectation that Israel may succeed next time, and therefore I think the system is now built for very rapid succession. That's actually how they survived.
But could it happen whilst he's still alive?
Well, no, I don't think so. Not after this war, because I think it would change too many things within Iran itself. And I think for some very big decisions in Iran, like agreeing to a deal with the United States, like the issue of hijab, would not have happened without him. The next Supreme Leader will be too weak. There will be too many other voices. I think he has put his hand down on certain things, and I think if we are to have a successful deal with the U.S., it would not go through unless it has his imprimatur. So it's in some ways it might be necessary that it be him, just like it had to be Khomeini who accepted the UN resolution that ended up Iran-Iraq war. Nobody else had that stature to accept defeat the manner he did.
Can I have one last question myself? Would any Iranian government regime give up its right to enrich uranium? I mean, a lot of people tell me that whether it was this, whether it's the Shah.
Depends on how you ask.
Sanam,
I'm going to dodge it and just say this, that it was the Shah was a nationalist leader, and it was the Shah who had his father removed from power by the U.S. and foreign powers in 1941. And I think that there are a lot of similarities where the Islamic Republic is today as it was during the Shah's time. It's regionally much more expansive, not integrated in the region, but at the same time not quite ambitious, looking to develop. And I doubt the Shah would have given up its indigenous rights. The Shah, we don't talk about enough of what the Shah did in the region, from his coming of age to when he was removed by his people. I think this has become much more of a nationalist Iran, and so it will be very hard for a future leader to abandon what they see as indigenous rights against injustice. And that narrative, carries forward.
Okay. Thank you very much, all of you, for that fascinating conversation. Thank you.